Welcome everybody. We've got to chapter 10, which is called Saul, the first king of Israel. The story of the Old Testament is, from a Christian point of view, the story of the education of the people of God. This makes it sound a much duller story than it really is. But education comes through the experience of living, and Israel learnt through the things that had happened to her, as they were explained by her long line of teachers beginning with Moses. One stage in her education was, as we have seen, when she learned that the faith and moral standards which she'd been given and which marked her out from all her neighbours centred on the insight into her peculiar role in the world which had been given to her through Moses. She had pledged herself by solemn covenant in Sinai to the service of Yahweh, and there were always some more sensitive spirits in the community who kept reminding her of it. She'd come through a testing time when she reached Canaan and discovered that it was only by holding fast to this tradition that she could save herself from being swallowed up in the hodgepodge of pagan beliefs and moral standards which she encountered in the Promised Land. The next stage in her education taught her a different lesson. It was that it was not the role of the people of God to be a nation like other nations. She had to learn that power politics, empire building, nationalism, and commercial expansion, things which are good enough in themselves, have no part in the distinctive contribution which God expected from the people of his choice. But all this could only be learned by bitter experience of trial and error. One of the most cherished possessions of these democrats of the desert was their independence. The tribes of Israel wanted no king to rule over them. They had no happy memories of their treatment under the pharaohs of Egypt. But as time went on and their numbers grew, through intermarriage and trade, but especially by their tough resistance to invaders from beyond the River Jordan, they'd become the most powerful element in Canaan. Indeed, Canaanites and Israelites had to all intents merged into one people. Now, however, a new threat to their existence appeared in the shape of the Philistines. These sea rovers from the Aegean had landed in Palestine and settled on the coastal plain soon after Joshua had staked Israel's claim to the highlands of Canaan. At first, the Philistines were content to live at peace with their new neighbours. But they were an ambitious and warlike race and soon set their hearts on conquering the whole country. About the year 1050 BC, they swept into the hills, sacked Israel's towns, including Shiloh, the religious centre of the tribes, and captured their most sacred possession, the Ark of the Covenant. It needed a catastrophe of this magnitude to make the tribes sink their differences, and for the first time agree to have a king ruling over them. The man who dominates the scene at this point in the story of the Bible is the prophet Samuel. It's difficult, however, to glean from the narrative just what part he played. At one moment, he's described as the man who reluctantly agreed to the popular demand for a king and warned the people that they were preparing a rod for their own backs. The next moment, we find him secretly selecting the man who, in his view, was the one whom the tribes needed at this point to pull them together and to rouse them against the Philistines. It's not impossible that there was a measure of truth in both stories. Samuel emerges in either case as the most significant religious leader since the days of Moses. He was involved in the election of Saul as the first king of Israel, and later in rejecting Saul in favour of his successor David. But for all this, he may well have had misgivings, as many did, about the whole idea of a monarchy among a people whose supreme loyalty and responsibility should be to Yahweh as their only liege lord. At all events, Saul makes his first impact on the tribes through his dramatic reaction to an appeal from an outlying Israelite settlement for help against marauders from the desert. The Ammonites had laid siege to the town of Jabesh Gilead beyond the River Jordan, and had announced that the whole settlement would be spared if the men of the place agreed to have their right eyes put out as a lesson to the rest of the Israelite tribes. The men asked for a week's grace, and then sent messengers to their kinsmen begging for help. Gibeah, where Saul was a farmer, was one of the Israelite townships to which they appealed. Saul heard the story as he came in from ploughing his fields. He belonged to a class of men who feature in the narrative quite a lot about this time, for whom the Hebrew word is Nabai, which is translated in the English Bible as prophet. The word is the same as that which was used of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and other great spokesmen of Israel, whose influence on the faith of Israel and on the whole of the Old Testament was, as we shall see, quite incalculable. The early type of Nabai was, however, as different from the later moulders of Israel's fortune as night is from day. He was more like the dancing dervish of modern times, a weird-looking holy man, usually wandering around the country, and rather looked down on by more solid citizens. He was normally a member of a group and could work himself into a kind of contagious hysteria or frenzy. When these people were caught up in one of their mass ecstasies, they were indifferent to pain and could slash themselves with knives without apparently feeling it. Saul had at one time been in contact with these people, and while remaining a respectable farmer, to some extent shared their odd behaviour, and was occasionally seized with the characteristic frenzy which later, in his case, turned to madness. But the main importance of the early type of Nabai lay in their fanatical devotion to Yahweh and their intense nationalism, and in this respect Saul was wholeheartedly one of them. A frenzy again came over him when he learned of the affront to his countrymen in Jabesh Gilead, and there and then he slew his oxen as he walked behind them from the field, cut them into pieces, and sent them like a fiery cross through the tribes of Israel, with the threat that whoever did not now rally to the cause of Yahweh and Israel would suffer a like fate. The effect was electric, not so much by reason of the threat, which was no more than a form of words, but by the sense that here at last was a leader, a new champion, a man whom all Israel would be prepared to serve. The clans rallied to his summons. Jabesh Gilead was relieved, and the remnants of the Ammonite army were sent fleeing back into the desert. But the heart of the whole people lifted at the thought that now the Philistine yoke could be broken. Saul's great opportunity came largely through his daredevil son, Jonathan. The Philistines had a garrison in Saul's own town of Gibeah, and Saul had gone up into the hills with a tiny force of 600 men. Jonathan, taunted by the garrison, took them by surprise. Saul rushed to his aid, scattered tribesmen joined his tiny force, and the Philistines were driven from the hills into the plain. This was a notable victory for Israel, and the Battle of Michmash meant that she was for a time free from Philistine rule. It's perhaps worth mentioning that during the Palestine campaign against the Turks in World War I, a British commander who knew his Bible followed Saul's tactics and, relying on the geographical details given in the story, routed the Turks, as Saul and Jonathan had routed the Philistines. The result of the battle was that Saul was elected the first king of Israel. In Saul's lifetime, the Israelite kingdom was small enough, a narrow strip of territory among the hills. But it was a beginning. For the rest of his days, Saul had to fight for it against the Philistines, and it was in battle against them that he died. From now on, however, his career was affected by two quite different things. One was the increasing deterioration of his mind. The nervous frenzy which had given him such a hold over the tribesmen now turned into brooding melancholia, which burst into mad fits. At such times he was capable of murder, and it was doubtless this instability that lost him the support of Samuel. The other factor that changed his fortunes was the emergence of a rival to his throne in the person of a young and dashing general, David.